Thanks everyone. Thanks everybody for joining us. As you can see, we have a lot of people from around the world. We actually have 45 countries signed up for this session. That's really, really nice. It's a mix of NGOs, university researchers, hospital, health administration, government, transport professionals and journalists. So welcome all of you. The Alliance, the Global Alliance of NGOs for Road Safety, we are a platform, an umbrella organization for NGOs who work on road safety, and we have 242 NGOs under our umbrella. And in the group, there is a strong eagerness to join forces with agendas which are outside our own road safety agenda. And this is really the idea behind these Alliance live sessions, that we're learning from other agendas and other areas. This is the fifth session of where we are putting spotlight on other agendas, and today we're going to look at environment and emission and road safety. And to hold our hands through this session, we have Natalie Draisin with us, who is from the FIA Foundation, and the FIA Foundation is one of the big supporters of the Alliance throughout the time we've been in existence. So we are in very good hands there. And with us, we also have Holger Dalkmann from DfID, and we have Maruxa Cardama from SLOCAT. And we have Gilbert-Patrick from UN Environment. So thank you very much for joining us. Carly says that she might have a little bit of problem with the internet, but it looks fine now. So Natalie, would you please take it away? And thank you to all of you for joining us, and welcome.
Sure, and thank you so much, Lotte, and the entire Alliance for asking me to moderate. And thanks to our speakers for joining us. We're really pleased to have all these longtime leaders at the crossroads of road safety and the environment who are truly perfect for our discussion today. And I'd also like to thank all of you who are tuning in from all around the world. I see lots of colleagues and friends and some new names too, and it's really a pleasure to have you with us. And I hope you and your families are safe and are healthy. As Lotte mentioned, the Foundation has been a longtime supporter of the Global Alliance, and we really continue to be impressed by the impact that it's had on road safety since the beginning, all around the world. And it's really clear that the potential of NGOs like yours to shape the future has never been greater than it is today. This pandemic is horrific, but it has one positive side effect. That's that many of us are seeing the changes we've advocated for so long. Fewer cars, more people walking and cycling, safer streets, and cleaner air. And these changes don't happen in silos, of course. They're living, breathing examples of how the road safety and environment agendas can complement each other to create a healthier world and to save lives. But how do we make these changes universal and long-term? What can we learn from the most proactive cities? And what do road safety NGOs really need to do to make sure that these solutions are represented from every country and every region, as we see on this call? Well, at the FIA Foundation, we convened a group of experts ranging from NGOs to governments for a special COVID-19 online meeting to answer this question. There were some key themes that emerged, like the need to protect shared mobility, support walking and cycling, and end car dependency. And we also talked about the need to build capacity, form alliances like we have here, and include vulnerable groups. Our Child Health Initiative, for example, will focus on how to keep kids safe and healthy as they go back to school. And we'll soon add to our online toolkit that I hope you'll check out, as it will talk specifically about how to marry the areas of road safety and the environment. And the resources are a really good complement to what we'll discuss today. And my FIA Foundation colleagues who I see on the chat, I'm sure one of them will post the link online. to thank you, and they've been working hard on that toolkit. And throughout our discussion today, and throughout the discussion that we had with our experts, there's one common thread, and that's policy change. And it's one of the many things that I know these road safety NGOs that we have on the call today are very skilled at, which is good because we need you. We currently have a window of opportunity for policy change. We heard about this in the second Alliance webinar in the series, which I really hope you'll watch. In that webinar, we talked about the fact that we currently have 3 necessary factors to bring about policy change. The first is awareness of a problem. The second is availability of solutions. And the third is prominence in the agenda. Today, we're going to talk about a 4th factor. That's a stronger connection between the road safety and environment agendas. Together, these agendas are greater than the sum of their parts. Road safety NGOs are change makers. And from what I've heard from Lotte and what she just mentioned, there's really a hunger among you to combine forces with the environment agenda. Now, I want to take just a moment to acknowledge my admiration for that, because it takes courage to extend a hand to another agenda and to join forces, and it's no small feat. At the FIA Foundation, though, we know that the combination of the road safety and environment agendas is truly essential to achieving safe and healthy journeys. So I'd like to congratulate you on the courage it takes to take that step. How can we do this? How can road safety NGOs connect with the environment agenda to make the positive changes here to stay? That's what we're going to talk about today. Our goal is to view this from an NGO perspective and pinpoint some ways that we can work together. We don't want this to be a lecture. Rather, we really want this to be a discussion where we can all share and learn. So please use the chat function to ask a very short and easy to read question. You're welcome to also share resources or larger statements if you want, but I'm going to do myself a favor and only read the really short questions. Please also remember to post them to all attendees, as it was mentioned, so that everybody can see them. I'm going to just start with a couple of questions of my own to kick off. So Carly in Kenya, I'd like to start with you. In the second webinar in this series, we heard about how the pandemic is highlighting a shared agenda between road safety and sustainable mobility. That's fewer cars and lower speeds. And I know from our FIA Foundation and UNEP collaboration on Share the Road that developing policy to address the connection between the two is really a core aim of your work. Can you tell us more about the links between lower emissions and safe roads and how this can save lives?
Thanks for your question, and thanks everyone for being here for this important conversation. I think for me it's really important to take a step back and consider that our planet has some really big problems right now. So we've got climate change, air pollution, millions of road fatalities, lack of social equity in just being able to access basic goods and services, and now, as if that's not enough, we've had COVID-19 thrown into the mix. And when we look at all of those problems, the one thing that we know for sure is that transport is a contributing factor in all of them. So, if we want to reduce the negative impact transport makes, whether our priority is road safety or our priority is the environment or social equity, if we make a real positive change for one, chances are it will make a positive change somewhere else, because what they have in common is their negative impact on society and people. So I think, what we need to all remember, whether it's us as UNEP or you're a road safety NGO or you're working in academia, is we kind of need to work a bit backwards. So rather than, saying what are the links, how can we make links, is actually think about who are we trying to help and what do they need from us as a development community to get that help. Then we can all do our bit. So for me personally at UNEP, I'm trying to help pedestrians and cyclists, particularly the most vulnerable, including children, to be able to walk to school without getting run over by a car. But at the same time, they also want to be able to walk to school and breathe clean air. So that person that I'm trying to help needs numerous things in parallel, and they're all connected in order for them to join their basic human rights. So I think when we look at it from the perspective of what do the people we need, what do the people we're trying to help need, it's really clear on what the links are.
Thank you so much, Carly. You know, what just really stuck out to me about what you said was that a positive change for one agenda is really a positive change for all. And I think that it's so important to remember that we're not competing with each other. We're actually all working towards the same goal. Now, Maruxa and Holger, from our work together, I know that the link between low emissions and safer roads has also been a really core pillar of your efforts. I'd love to know what other links you see, just building off of what Carly mentioned. And Maruxa, let's go ahead and start with you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Natalie, and thank you, everyone. Thanks to the Alliance for pulling off this event. I think the topic is very relevant, and it's as relevant as ever to bring agendas together. So kudos to all of those who are actually trying to bring different agendas together, and the stakeholders that belong to those agendas as well, to talk to each other. I think there is a lot to gain out of that, and it's a delight for me to be sharing the panel with good colleagues and good friends. So thanks very much for the opportunity. And I think that Carly has just nailed it. To some extent, these two topics, when they come together, and if now you add the COVID-19 layer to them, they just bring into the surface a series of socioeconomic and environmental challenges that we always knew were there, but we were simply not wanting to address. So I think that right now we sit on that opportunity where we have that magnifying glass, that we are seeing all this happening at the same time. Perhaps it's worth reminding us of some of the figures, isn't it? So we are saying that as of the beginning of this week, as of 2nd June, let me get the figure right, COVID-19 deaths totaled globally 376,000 across the globe. But we know that global road traffic crashes are killing 4 times that amount of people a year. They're killing 1.35 million each year, if I got my figure right here. So it's true that COVID-19 is a pandemic that has captured the world's attention, but we have other ongoing silent and not silent, no so silent pandemics, whether it is fatalities on the roads, whether it is climate change, for which we have no vaccines, but we do have solutions and we know they exist. And in the case of road fatalities, let's not forget that still today is the primary killer of those between 5 and 29 years. So I think that we could be missing a bit the point if we thought that it's just about improving safety or reducing emissions. I think that the point at the end is about how do these two agendas bring together or come together? They come together because it's about stopping unnecessary human and economic suffering. It's just about that. And those two agendas brought together have got incredible strength to actually help us move into that. But we can only actually get there if we understand that the two agendas could be maximized, if we look at the wider transformation of the mobility systems, if we really understand mobility as a right. So access to clean and safe mobility as a right, I think could be almost a motto in which these two agendas would come together and could be, able to unleash its potential from socio-economic and environmental areas. But I'm going to bring it to Holger because, let's keep it dynamic and perhaps then I can build upon and continue. So Holger, can't wait to hear what you got to say.
Thanks, Maruxa. And first, there's a big thanks also to Lotte also from the Alliance, and also thanks also to Natalie also for facilitating, and really also Sophia Foundation showing a lot of leadership also, not just now in the COVID-19 crisis, but also overall in the field of emissions as well as of road safety. So I was listening to Carly and Maruxa. What else to say after those two? So almost playing bingo in terms of, okay, what else can I still add? So to keep us as a spirit, to keep it short, I think what really struck me in the last 2-3 decades, in fact, how the whole discussion has moved from individual impacts, from individual activities, which are still also important, but also to an overall narrative. So We have also Jack Wisman, so saying hi also to Jack, who's one of the key people also in terms of advertising and really advising us on safe systems. So in road safety, so from specific single elements to also really to holistic thinking. And here we also have the avoid, shift, improve narrative. And that doesn't work just also on emissions, it works on road safety at the same time. So if we reduce the length of trips, if it improves the accessibility for all people, that also reduces the exposure to air pollution, as well as also the risk also of hit also by car accident. We have the shifters, so the more people walking, cycling, shared modes, public transport. And that's also not just also good also from the emission and climate side, but also we found out when I worked at the World Resources Institute, there's a lot of evidence that when you also have safe walking and cycling infrastructure, and also people moving also towards public transport, this is also the safer way. So this is actually saving also more lives than also just also the technical issues, as well as the improved side, really also to improve also the infrastructure, improve also the vehicles. And we'll talk more about also how the NGOs can actually make use of that. But I think that is that spirit of an integrated system, of a holistic vision towards also livable cities is crucial. And that also can create also far more lines, and it's great also that we have so many people also online, and we can further discuss how to strategize that.
Thank you so much. You know, just two things that stood out. Maruxa, you mentioned how these issues were always here, we just kind of avoided them, and now they're under a magnifying glass, we can't ignore them anymore. I think that's definitely true of this pandemic. And Holger, you talked about the avoid, shift, improve narrative that I also think is an important thing for NGOs to understand. I'd like to follow up with kind of a practical question, because you've clearly convinced all of us that, you know, we should work together with the environment agenda, but how do we do that? We know that we can get there farther and faster advocating together, but lots of these NGOs on our call are experts in road safety. In fact, I would say all of them are, but they might be novices in the area of emissions, but they want to connect with emissions organizations and environment organizations. So where do we start? Where can they start? What's the best way to extend that firsthand to the other agenda? Let's see, Holger, since we started with Carly last time.
I saw Maruxa was also waving, so Maruxa, if you want to go ahead. So, well, it's obviously harder to answer this question. I think we have people from 45 countries, from low-income countries to so people who's in the US and Canada and so on. We have people advocating on local and national level. So just as three sorts. I think first of all is on the local level. So getting out of the box, getting also working also with organizations like I mentioned, pedestrian organizations, cycling organization. I just heard yesterday also all the work currently also cycling associations are doing on the ground and helping also to closing roads, providing also necessary food also to people who also not have currently also access. So also really also in the COVID crisis also to see what kind of initiatives are locally there, so to raise this awareness, which is also going beyond also that particular safety issue. And I think we also can also form also these alliance. I think on the national level, there's so many different options on national campaigns. So again, also taking just an example also from India, so Ragri, an initiative also by NGOs, really also providing also pushing also for car-free Sundays first, and then also with a wide range of coalition from also the media also to local NGOs to really also showcase really also what sustainable mobility also can look like. Kenya also have a whole research network, which now also is joined by advocacy groups where there is exchange latest knowledge and also bring that also into action. And then there's the last but not least, obviously, and I'm sure also Maruxa and Natalie can more talk about that, really also working also with the international NGOs. every international campaign like FIA Foundation worked so hard and successfully also on really getting the SDG 3.6 on road safety also there, but that needs advocacy on the local level, and those can also provide guidance in terms of how also to do that. And Maruxa, hand over probably also to her so to tell more about also the latest NDC campaign they're running, which I think is also a fantastic idea.
Maruxa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much. Holger is making it very easy for me, you know, now I can just continue. No, thanks a lot. I mean, the list can be so huge that the last thing I would like to do is to end up discouraging, isn't it? Our fellow colleagues here in this call. I think it's more of a menu, and then as Holger was saying it, the realities are very different, and of course each NGO has got its mission and knows its reality, and I think we should never underestimate the importance of localizing the actions in order for them to be relevant. So with my comments go with all the respect to my colleagues who operate at those local levels, and in the understanding that I don't know those realities as much as they do. But there's a couple of things that come to mind. I think the first one could be, in this moment in which we're going to see a lot of different stimulus packages, socioeconomic recovery measures kicking in, I think it's as important as ever that we champion that avoid, shift and improve framework, which has a hierarchy into it, which has a balance, the framework that Holger just explained to us. So first and foremost, avoid unnecessary trips, then shift to less polluting, to zero carbon modes, in which we have active mobility, which is an essential component of some of the solutions we have seen developed almost in the spur of the moment across cities around the globe, from Bogota to Kigali, with all the pop-up bike lanes and reclaiming streets all over the place in order to still be able to have a social life in times of pandemic. And last but not least, of course, is the improve agenda. So I think that's essential. Champion that balanced avoid, shift and improve framework is going to be as important as ever in order to make sure that a paradigm of sustainable low carbon mobility is not fragmented, and that we don't start playing public transport against walking or cycling against walking or vice versa. It's very important that we take that into consideration. I think that our NGOs are probably working with people, and I think that is a crucial moment to work with people more than ever. I think that we're all people, besides our jobs, wherever our jobs are, we're all citizens, we're all parents and sisters and brothers and siblings. And it's very important, the transformation that we've seen right now. We have seen that behavioral change is possible. I am not saying that it's easy, but it's possible. And one of the barriers we have encountered in our movement has been convincing people that behavioral change can occur. And recently in the FIA Foundation webinar that your colleagues put together last week, we also heard how different organizations are coming up with surveys and the statistics that are showing us that there's more inclination towards behavioral change in mobility patterns than there's ever before. So that is something to harness, I think. And I think that another area in which NGOs tend to be very good, because they can be neutral, is brokering conversations across the different stakeholders, across the different levels of government, and across the different government departments. Let's not take for granted that that occurs. We know very well that a ministry working on environment might not be thinking the same things as a minister or ministry working on transport and infrastructure, and the ministry in charge of the monies might be putting the money somewhere else and not into those priorities. So that element of policy coherence that NGOs can be good at identifying, I think can be very good. And now a word to what Holger so kindly threw at me. So that combination of local work and international work. At the local level, I think that NGOs can also be very good at supporting government officials in small cities, in small and secondary towns across places in the global south, in which we shouldn't take for granted how difficult it is to combine, for instance, land planning and transport planning, and whether that capacity, to what point that capacity is so essential. And sometimes NGO can see that more clearly than an official who has a ton of things to do a day. And internationally, indeed, NGOs can support governments at different levels and can also engage themselves in making sure that a series of framework documents that national governments need to submit in the framework of the Paris Agreement for Climate Change champion a strong dimension of sustainable low carbon mobility. And those documents, as Holger was saying, are the nationally determined contributions, for instance, in which countries are supposed to be telling us what measures are they going to take in order to curb emissions in the horizon of 2025. they are accompanied as well by other set of documents called the long-term strategies, which are supposed to be looking into the 2050 horizon, and therefore allow us to look into more detail into the wider transformation in that avoid, shift and improve approach that we were talking about. So plenty of work there, whether it is at the local level, at the international, whether it is on capacity, whether it is on engagement, or whether it is on working with people and harnessing the behavioral change movement that we are witnessing right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maruxa. You know, you mentioned brokering conversations, and I think one important step to take is just making sure that both the road safety and the environment agendas are at the table at those conversations. And for an NGO on the ground doing road safety, you know, going back to Holger, what you said, the power of international organizations. One thing NGOs on the ground can do is go to that international organization, come to us and say, I don't know the environment side of things. Do you have a connection in my country that you could give us? That's the fun of the job, right? Is connecting the dots, is connecting people and making sure that the right people are at the table. So if you want the other side of the table and you don't know them, just ask. And that's, we're only as strong as our partners. So that's really where the power lies. Holger, you were going to mention something.
Yeah, so just so probably also then can raise that directly also to Carly. I'm not sure as I have worked a lot also for the international NGOs, and I'm not sure if we actually as a community, as international organization, are doing enough also to really empower. So you shared also your toolkit for this very specific initiative, which is great. But I just wonder, so is there, and probably it's a question to Lotte as well as also the participant, what kind of information is actually more needed is on the ground, that is so you really feel is on the ground is empowered and have also the right material. And I would challenge here a little bit in terms of the international approach. Is there enough? And probably also UNEP has the answer to that.
Do you want me to, should I jump in, Natalie?
Please, yes.
Okay. I think, you know, as much as we're here saying how important it is to collaborate across areas, even when you look at the way the UN agencies are set up, we're already saying, you know, we're here for health, we're here for environment, we're here for cities, we're here for children. So, you know, even at that international level, we're also taking lessons from this webinar right now about how we can work better in less of a silo. I think we are getting better at doing that, but it's still very much a challenge. And also when you look at the international funding opportunities, they're also very clear, you know, there's a fund out there for road safety and there's a fund out there for climate. And yes, you can apply for funding for a project for climate and you can mention there are co-benefits for road safety, but really it's all about climate. So there are still some systematic systems that we have to work through. And I think it's actually more possible at national and city level to kind of overcome those silos. I think, you know, we are, even within the program I run, Share the Road, it's always been set up to help pedestrians and cyclists for road safety, for the environment, for access. But we're still trying to work out the best way to work at a global level, but also bring in all of these local NGOs across cross-cutting issues. So I think there's still, you know, part of the reason we're having this call is to work out how we can do that. Just a few other things I wanted to mention. I think, you know, sometimes when I talk to individual organizations, NGOs, there's this, not a fear, but a worry about crossing over boundaries. You know, we're road safety, will environment want to talk to us, and vice versa. But what I've come to realize over the years is the answer is always yes, please. You know, the global car fleet is due to triple by 2050. So that's the environment's problem, but it's road safety's problem as well. Like, we're all fighting that same problem. So there's a real feeling that people want to work together, but just need a bit of encouragement to actually just go and do it. And I think, you know, someone mentioned this idea of just, I think it was you, Natalie, who said, just ask. And that, like you said, it's the fun of the job is connecting those dots. And just, you know, all of the people who are talking here have got connections across road safety and the environment. I'm very happy to get a call that says, you know, I've got a project coming up in Indonesia. Who can I speak to on the environment side? You know, there are lots of people on this webinar that are all about networks and putting people in touch with each other. And the final point I wanted to make is just around, you know, that yes, the realities are all very different, but I think there's one key principle from an advocacy perspective, is that it's all about collaboration and networks. Our collective voices are always stronger. So seeking out other organizations, whether it's in the country, if you're working at national, city, neighborhood level, seeking out organizations that are maybe doing things that seem completely different to you, but actually there are normally synergies. When it comes to helping people, there are always connection points.
Natalie, I wonder if I could just chime in super
Please.
quick. It's so interesting what I'm hearing from both Carly and Holger, that I'm, you know, just to build upon what I've heard, and I'm bringing the ball to us. So we were saying, like, what can the NGO colleagues who are today with us do? Fantastic, but what can we do? So those of us who are operating more at the international level or in global organizations, whether it is around multilateral systems or international NGOs, like the one I have the pleasure of being part of, I think we can do a lot as well, in the sense that we are partially guilty as well. Let me just like put it a bit dramatic. I think that we are partially guilty of having kept, to some extent, the climate agendas and the sustainability agendas separated. We know they are operated in the United Nations level through different intergovernmental processes, let's say, but I think we have not really overcome that silo thinking, that separation, and that makes it very difficult afterwards to actually help the NGOs have a holistic narrative and carry out holistic projects. Another thing that perhaps we have not been particularly good at, it's watching the money and putting more pressure on the money, following the money and seeing where it goes. We have seen that international financial institutions and multilateral development banks are really trying hard to redirect the money to certain places. But at the end of the day, if the member state countries who sit in the boards don't actually want those IFIs or those MDBs, multilateral development banks, to go that way, things are not going to go that way. And perhaps the last point in which we have not been as good as we could, even if we try. But disclaimer, it's very difficult because there's a lot of richness occurring there in the real world. It's really learning from the practices in the real world. We keep compiling and compiling and compiling case studies in libraries, but we seldom actually go into taking the deep dive in analyzing what are the critical factors that don't belong perhaps to the very formal recipe, but are those soft governance elements, for instance, that are going to take you to transform a mobility system in a city, besides the engineering and mechanical or economic aspects of it. So I think that on those three areas, we could improve as well as international actors, if I can call us ourselves that way, just for the sake of, you know, getting across. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Maruxa. Those are such important points. And, you know, you talk about what's happening at the ground level. And I'd like to make that my third question, because we started by talking about policy change, right? And the power of policy change. And as we all know from experience, road safety NGOs are particularly good at advocating for life-saving policies, but what are the policies that you've seen around the world in response to COVID-19, the policies that touch on both environment and road safety, that can, you know, reduce fuel emissions and save lives, getting people walking and cycling more as well? And how can NGOs really promote these specific policies that touch on both agendas? So let's just take a moment to learn from those real life changes that Maruxa mentioned. And Maruxa, because I know you've been doing so much of this with SLOCAT, as you all have truly, Maruxa, I'd like to start with you on that.
Thanks, Natalie. Well, just a few examples that I tried to put together with my colleagues in the team for the sake of this webinar. But indeed, there's so much going on out there that I know for a fact that I'm not making any justice to the reality of what's going on right now. But let's think, for instance, about lowering speed limits. We've seen incredible cases where actually there's been an active choice in lowering speed limits because we already knew that they were going to be speeding up. Think about the Isle of Man in the UK, for instance. staying in the UK, let me stay in London for a moment, keeping the urban access regulation, even in times of COVID, or reinstalling it. It was lifted for a little while, but now it's being reinstored. It's a strong regulation. It's linked to the low emission zones and the ultra low emission zones. And that's a very important aspect. And it's never easy, isn't it, to take a regulatory step. If you remove it, there's always the risk that you will never be able to bring it back. So I think that London has shown a lot of courage there as a city. We have seen in Kigali, for instance, incredible examples of open streets, of reclaiming the streets for people's life with all social distances and required for this moment, but actually emphasizing the need for exercise and giving that space for social cohesion that is as needed as ever. I think that we have also seen wonderful examples about ensuring the mobility of essential workers, because let's not forget that during COVID, at the peak of COVID pandemic, public transport has still been key to move those essential workers who have kept our cities, our places running. And also freight has been essential to keep us supplied. Medical supplies and all the things we have been eating and all the things we have been ordering online. So we have seen, for instance, in Bogota, the deployment of, I have here the figure of 400 free electric bikes to help health workers access their workplaces and respond to the COVID pandemic. We have also seen in Buenos Aires, for instance, the public transport fleet running with a normal schedule, with all the economic losses you can imagine they must have had on the city, but nevertheless, they make that effort. We have also seen in Abu Dhabi, for instance, the Transport Authority operating more frequencies than ever in order to, as a measure of crowd control and offering a safer space with less demand. And last but not least, I can obviously not forget about the temporary bike lanes. I've already mentioned them. We have the examples of Indian cities, becoming really booming experiments of pop-up cycling lanes. And Lima, I have the figure here, designing 301 kilometers of bike lanes, starting from the ambitious goal of 142 kilometers in 45 days. So there's been examples of political ambition, political leadership in cities across the globe. The key question now is, are we going to keep this? Are we going to learn from what this means? And are we going to incorporate this active mobility, tactical urbanism, joint spatial planning and transport planning approaches as part of the new normal of any mobility and transport project in a city? Is that going to be the case? And is the money going to be there to fund those soft investment projects in mobility that are as relevant as ever? And they've always been, but they have not attracted the same amount of money as highways or airports and so on and so forth. So those are just a few examples, but there's many more out there, of course.
Yes, thank you, Maruxa. And you mentioned some low and middle income country examples, but I want to try to get even more of them. Holger, I remember in our conversations, you talked about how there just aren't enough and how we really need more. And you also talked about this in your recent action agenda on behalf of DfID, which we can also post in the chat and share thereafter, because I think it'll really be of interest to our participants. So I'd love to hear your examples from low and middle income country perspectives.
Yeah, thanks Natalie, and thanks also for highlighting that. Just also to make a little bit of advertisement, even I don't work for DfID, work in Factors as an independent consultant, but also as a program called High Volume Transport Program. And during that time, also DfID employed also data to really also workers with a lot of the other international institutions also to really also raise also the issue of COVID and mobility. So I can share also the link in a minute, because there's a quite interesting, from my perspective, material, but also for some of you, as there are researchers on the call, actually there's an open call for £1 million on also COVID-19 mobility in low-income countries. Because one of the things recognizing is, while all these great examples are there, as Maruxa shared, most of them are in the global north, and most of them are in fact also in capitals. And here, so the question is also how we can also support with also the international community, also the local institutions, the local pressure. I was heard yesterday also in India now, they also have lots of bets on Bangalore. There should be also the first really also new pop-up bike lane infrastructure, and then also through an NGO scheme called Bicycle Mayors, also then also to spread that also throughout India. However, there's also still a need also for specific guidance, specific ideas, localizing also in the local language in terms of also how it can be done. So there's a gap here where I see also that national NGOs can even also think about how we can also make also those examples A, more prominent, and B, also to support that from our perspective. Maruxa briefly, I think, mentioned also, no, I think you mentioned Kigali, but there's taking also Kampala. So in Uganda, there's an open letter by NGOs to the president saying, or thanking him also for mentioning cycling is in fact also the best modes of transport in an environment where cycling was not seen as an appropriate mode for everybody. So these kind of strong signals are possible, but really also the call would be for also to encourage far more local examples. Can be also just closing also your neighborhood street and share that. Developers are based on the local knowledge on black spots where there's a need to sharing also that technical knowledge. And but I finally also would, if I may also highlight, it's not just all about the cities. It's also about the national government. We have seen also, even also the US spending $25 billion US dollars basis on public transport, basis of campaigning also of Transport for America and a larger alliance to also say, well, we need also to save also public transport. And we have seen also investment in South Africa and India. So that's the topic. We have seen some countries also coming up with bicycle support like France and Italy. So these are also smaller money where we can also create also a new culture. And last but not least, so we should talk far more about what comes next post-COVID. So are we getting also the right recovery package and make them also aligned with SDG and climate? Sorry for getting on and on. I'll stop now.
That's okay. I think you just came up with our next webinar topic, post-COVID and recovery packages. Thank you, Holger. Carly, I'd like to turn that question over to you as well for policy examples you've seen, and then we will open it up to the audience for questions. Go ahead, Carly.
Okay, great, thanks. Now, of course, I'm slightly biased here because I run a walking and cycling program, but what has just really amazed me is how the underdogs of transport, so, you know, walking and cycling, seen in many countries all over the world as the last resort, if you're too poor to have a motorbike or a car, have really come to the fore and saved the day as far as mobility is concerned during COVID. And, you know, they've gained in popularity because they're perceived to offer the best chance of maintaining social distancing while moving around. And WHO, you know, produced a guidance saying stay at home, and if you can't stay at home, walk or cycle. And people are walking and cycling more, and as a result there's less pollution, and in turn it feels safer, and in turn people walk and cycle more. So you know, the citizens are really valuing how important it is to be able to access local services and nature, particularly important, you know, for urban residents. And this is having an impact on governments, and they're responding and improving public space and sidewalks and cycle lanes. And we've heard some examples. I'm not sure if it's a complete coincidence that the Minister for Transport for Ethiopia just yesterday launched their national walking and cycling policy, which we've been supporting them with for the last few years. And again, just a few weeks ago, Indonesia did the same and launched their national policy. There's a real momentum there. And I am still trying to unpack this myself, because NGOs, civil society, international organizations, whether it's road safety or environment, we've all been working tirelessly on these issues for years and years. And yes, we've been making a level of progress, but I don't think you can compare that to the speed of progress over the last few months during the COVID. And I'm still trying to unpack the kind of success of that and understand how we as a global community can learn from this kind of fast track success and see what we can apply after COVID. You know, if you can spend 10 years lobbying for something and then something happens and then all the changes you've wanted for 10 years come about in 2 months, what can we learn from that? And I don't really have all the answers. I think there is a real role for road safety NGOs to play in advocating at the level they're working at, whether that's neighborhood, city or national, to advocate to keep these COVID-induced investments even after COVID and expand, join up with other NGOs with shared aims, lobby governments for better infrastructure and to keep temporary infrastructure, keep asking, showcase the good practice and call out bad practice and lobby and advocate some more. Because if we can lock in these changes and we can continue to make people feel good when they're walking and cycling, then with that comes the demand, and with that less cars on the road, and we're safer and there are less emissions.
Thank you, Carly. And I like how you classify walking and cycling as the underdog. That's a good one. And I think I'm going to use it now. I'd like to open it up to audience questions at this point. I have a couple that came in beforehand, but I don't want that to mean that we can't also use the chat, because one thing we talked about earlier was that this call is also really informative for us as speakers. So please share your questions so that we know what you need and what answers, what questions you want answered. So even if we don't get to your question, please don't let that stop you from posting all the questions that you'd like. One question that came across before we started this conversation from our audience was that public transport, of course, is a way to achieve both agendas, reducing car use and emissions. But now, because of COVID-19, people are having to avoid public transportation to maintain social distancing. So how can road safety NGOs encourage safe, socially distanced use of public transport? And I'm gonna add to that one more question, and feel free to answer whichever one you want, that I see my colleague Richard also posted. And I think this is important in this conversation. It's important to understand that the road safety and environment agendas have a lot in common, but there's actually some dissonance too. And we shared, we talked about shared objectives and messages, but what are the differences that NGOs should be aware of when they're connecting with the field of environment and emissions, and how do they navigate that? I think that's an important thing to understand before, extending a hand to another agenda. Who'd like to start? Maruxa, please.
Me to take a dive, or at least try. On the question about public transport, let's be realistic. There's no mobility system in a city, in a place, if public transport is not there. So public transport is the backbone of the mobility system. And a mobility system is essential to equity, to social cohesion. So I think the equation is pretty clear there. If we're going to put all our monies in bailing out different socioeconomic sectors of our societies in this very difficult context of economic crisis, but we're going to let our public transport systems collapse, we're just going to get into very big trouble, social trouble, that is going to transform into even higher levels of inequality. And we're already living in horrendous levels of inequality in different places across the globe. So I think it's an important element to bear in mind. So the first thing would be to always bear in mind that public transport is the backbone of the mobility system that guarantees equitable access to mobility to people, linked therefore to these stimulus packages. And perhaps a word to informal transport here, because somehow we tend to think, just public transport, and we tend to forget that in many places in the global south, informal transport tries to, which is private sector driven, tries to overcome the lack of that public transport system, isn't it? And I think we got to get it bear it in mind. I think that another area to bear in mind as well is that some cities in Asia and some governments in Asia are already seeing an increased ridership post-COVID. So I think it would be very important to look to them and see how is that happening? What are the behavioral aspects, the crowd control aspects, the use of IT, of technology to actually manage demand and therefore offer more safety in these moments of physical distancing. And I always hear several colleagues of mine, and one of them is actually amongst the participants, Branwen Thornton from Walk 21. Have we learned enough from the SARS crisis, from the previous crisis some years ago that have impacted particularly certain areas of the world? Is there anything we can learn there about how public transport was protected after the SARS crisis? And last but not least on public transport, work with local governments. Let's not forget that in many instances it's going to be local and regional government And the transport authorities that kind of rely on their shoulders, the ones who are going to be facing the burden of having to keep public transport systems running with hardly no access to finances. So one of the most important things I think NGOs can do in order to support public transport, it's support that plea for access to finance right now in order to direct it to local and regional governments in order to sustain public transport. To your second question very quickly, Natalie, otherwise I'm taking a lot of time. Yes, there are differences. I was reading the question there, particularly like increasing, for instance, the turnover of fleets. Well, that's because we only look at the improved part of the equation, isn't it? In which we're only looking at the car or the vehicle efficiency or the fuel efficiency of it. And of course, if we do so, we are forgetting about the other parts in which perhaps between avoid and shift, there is less clash between both agendas. But we shouldn't forget, for instance, about the elements of batteries. We know very well that batteries is an area in which there can be a huge clash, and I think that from the transport sector, perhaps we have to start paying a bit more attention to it, because it's also an issue of inequality across countries. We just export all that rubbish at the end of its life without any sort of environmental control into it. And equally important, I think, is going to be the notion of business models behind it. So how can we support business models that are more oriented towards the social corporate responsibility and that take into consideration the environmental factors much more? So I think there is an economic element there that pivots around the car industry and about that particular point that was made in the question around a turnover of fleets. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maruxa. Holger, Carly? Who wants to? Holger, go ahead. I saw you on mute.
Oh, okay.
Carly, I'll let you duke it out. Holger muted
you
himself.
Go, Holger,
Carly,
go
ahead.
Holger.
Carly, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, sure. Just a few points. One on public transport. I think we've talked a lot about the role of NGOs in advocating with and influencing government, but there's also the side around influencing and supporting and advocating with the public or our citizens. And there's some discussions coming up about after lockdown around the world ease and public transport opens up, this kind of residual safety fear around using public transport. And I think there's a real value there for NGOs working at city and neighborhood and even national level to kind of help ease that fear through supporting citizens and really tying up with other NGOs working around health to kind of show that, where there are safety mechanisms put in place, that it is safe to use public transport and how important public transport is. So I think that kind of managing that residual safety fear with the public. And, Richard, our colleague from Fear Foundation, raised a really good question about there are conflicts around the environmental and road safety agenda. And this is something that I find even running a walking and cycling program within an environmental agency, where there's a lot of time and resource and focus put on the switch to electric vehicles. But, for the majority of citizens who are walking in countries where they may be earning less than $1 a day and can't even afford a bicycle, the idea of this kind of transition to electric mobility, right now their immediate safety needs are not going to be met by the phasing in of electric cars. So I think we do have to, be honest with ourselves and with each other that there are conflicts, there are limited resources. But I think what's really important as an NGO working in road safety, you still want to be at the table. You still want to be part of that discussion, because even if there are decisions being made in the country you work in about resources, you still want to have your voice and make sure that, if financing is being put into a transition to, say, electric cars, you can make sure that you have a voice and a chance to influence funding. So I think it's important to accept there are conflicts, but we still need to be at the table, even more so where there are conflicts over there being complementary areas.
Absolutely. And Holger, you've really worked at the crossroads of these two areas as well. What are some of the conflicts that you've seen?
Well, I first of all I agree also with Carly. Let's not hide also where there are issues, and also I think to as a community also to get also the best research into that. So are there really also conflicts? What are they? And also what are also then the common nominators for also then also campaigning? So I think here is also a call also for research, saying because when you look in terms of the level of research when it comes also to different impacts, it gets a little bit trickier, even also when we look into the obvious impactors of local speed reduction, like from 50 kilometers to 30, reducing also the risk from 80 also to 10% in terms of dying. The causes for air pollution is not so clear. Other issue is, for example, when we talk not just about the electric car, but there is a particular, I know so the past is a discussion also with WHO when there is a recommend like, oh, we should not have electric two-wheelers. These are also the main also sources, so which is more affordable and also cleaner. So in particular in South Asia. So here we're so to be also transparent about that and see also, okay, where are also issues we still also have differences, but also these differences can be also more discussed also between also the NGOs, rather than also making that also at the round table and seeing also where are also the common issues we can also still also advocate from, rather than also fighting against each other. Just also on the public transport and what NGOs can do. I think there's also a great opportunity now also to help the local community. So in terms of there's still in some places there's a lack of knowledge in terms of how is it to clean also the vehicles, how is it to have the hygiene, how is it, and there are international organizations like UITP and public transport who have the guidance, but this needs to be also localized. At the same time, then there's advocating in terms of does it have to be used? So we talked a lot about walking and cycling. Not everybody can do that. Sometimes the distance is too far. But also I think it's currently rescuing also public transport by putting less pressure on, and also really talking more about walking, cycling, and also to implement that. And I saw also one of the question was that or statements also that low-income countries not everywhere have the space. That's correct, but there's particularly in the larger cities, you have some of the infrastructure where you could easily put also some barriers in, and that also it's a low cost solution, but it needs also leadership and here so institutions like also local NGOs saying, oh, we also want that, and standards in that together.
Thank you so much, Holger. So we only have about a minute left, so I want to just wrap it up with a couple of key takeaways that I've seen, and then I'll turn it over to Lotte. The first thing that I really struck me was the avoid, shift, improve narrative. I think that's one that unifies both of these agendas and that can be very powerful in even beginning discussions with the environment agenda. The second is that we have so many good policies around the world. It's a question of finding them, of learning from them, of disseminating them. And I know that these NGOs really have the power to push them forward. And also, policies specifically focusing on what Carly called the underdogs of transport, walking and cycling. Third, this is an important time to reach out of our comfort zones, to extend a hand across the aisle. Yes, there are some differences between both agendas, and it's important to understand that, but there are far more things that unite us rather than divide us. And that's especially a common goal to save lives. And last but not least, don't be afraid to reach out and ask. I want to make connections with an environment NGO in my area. Do you know any? Tell us what you need. The international NGOs are here to help. And so I'd like to thank Lotte and the Alliance for this opportunity, and to thank our speakers for their time and all of our participants. because if I've learned anything from the Alliance, it's that you know how to make change happen. And especially today, you give me hope. So I'd like to thank you for what you do, and please stay safe.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, all speakers. It's been immensely interesting. I think a few things really came up very clearly for me. I think one of the things that were mentioned around the structural silos in terms of funding and multilateral setups and sort of mindsets, and how that sort of infiltrate everything we do. And it's not just a matter of us wanting to step across those lines, but it's also a lot of structures that are already set up. I think what I really liked hearing also was about the local knowledge and tapping into that, the advocacy that you encouraged us to do, make your voice heard, be at the table, as Carly said, and influence where funding is going. I think some of those things were very, very refreshing to hear. And then finally, that you see there's a big group of friends here, there's a big group of people who really want to make change, and all NGOs, please use this as an opportunity to reach out to new friends, make new friends, and let us work together. There's tons of other great points made today, and fortunately this session has been recorded. So you can go back and listen to it again, and you see Carly has already added her email address there, so there you go. But we're putting resources up on our website as well, so some of you have already added some of the things that you're doing, and please keep that coming so we can make sure that we just connect more and more and learn from each other. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. This is part of the Alliance live sessions. Next week we have another session which will focus on road safety and gender. And I hope you will tune in again there. So today, thank you very much for your time, Holger, Maruxa, and Carly, and Natalie. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to all the participants, all the NGOs, all our friends. Thank you, and take care. Look after yourself. Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.